He considered this seriously. "Not entirely," he said, "but it is not the most important thing in this room right now." She held his gaze. He could see something working in her expression, the specific accounting of a person who is used to being right and is encountering information that requires revision. "I was dismissive," she said. "I made a judgment without information, and I was wrong. I would like to acknowledge that directly." "You can say that once," James said, "which you just did. Then I would like to talk about your inventory problem, if you are ready." She looked at him for a long moment. Then something in her face settled. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Acceptable," she said. The deal took 6 weeks to structure. James had been approached about a full acquisition in the second week and had declined, clearly and without drama. Nexus Supply was not for sale. What he was willing to consider was a partnership, Ashworth Digital as a client, paying for the platform at standard enterprise rates, and as a minority investor, with Nexus Supply maintaining complete operational independence. A joint advisory seat for James on the integration project. A defined roadmap for the Meridian deployment that gave his team the access and the timelines they needed to do the work correctly. Victoria had pushed on the acquisition twice, because that was how she negotiated. She asked for what she wanted, and when she did not get it, she asked again to confirm that she was not getting it. The second time James said no, she moved on. The deployment began in the third week after the deal closed. It was not simple. 14 systems, each with its own data model and its own quirks, each integrated into Meridian's operational workflows in ways that were partly documented and partly living in the institutional memory of people who had been working with those systems for years. James's team spent the first 3 weeks doing what he called archaeology, mapping the actual terrain rather than the documented terrain, which were, as they invariably were, substantially different. The mapping produced something that Ashworth Digital's operations team found simultaneously impressive and alarming, a complete picture of what the 14 systems were actually doing, individually and in relation to each other, for what appeared to be the first time in Meridian's operating history. Robert Mensah, reviewing the map, said, "This is what we should have had before the acquisition." "Yes," James said, "that is usually true." "Can it be built prospectively, before acquisitions rather than after?" "Yes," James said, "that is actually what the platform was designed to do. The post-acquisition case is the harder version." Robert filed this for later. The coordination layer went live across all 14 systems 11 weeks after the deployment began. The order fulfillment error rate, which had been 11%, fell to 1.4% within the first month of full operation. Not zero. James had told them it would not be zero, that the residual errors would reflect problems upstream of the coordination layer that the layer could not fix, but 1.4%, which was below the industry benchmark and substantially below what anyone on the operations team had believed was achievable with the existing infrastructure. The error resolution team, which had been spending 30% of its time managing incorrect orders, saw that proportion fall to under 8%. They redeployed the freed capacity to client success work, proactive engagement, relationship building, the work that made clients feel valued rather than managed. 3 of Meridian's enterprise clients in the first 60 days after the coordination layer went live reached out to their account managers unprompted to comment on the improvement in service quality. Victoria presented the results to her board 6 months after the acquisition close. The integration that had threatened, in its first weeks, to become the most expensive mistake she had made in 12 years of building Ashworth Digital, had become instead a case study in post-acquisition operational recovery. She presented it as such, directly, without managing the narrative, in the specific honesty about difficulty and resolution that she had found, over 12 years, was the only thing worth offering aboard. She referenced Nexus Supply by name. She referenced James Okafor by name. She said, in a room where precision was the currency of credibility, the most consequential decision we made in this integration was engaging a partner who had been solving this problem for 4 years, while the industry claimed it could not be solved. The board asked about the partnership structure. Victoria explained it. One board member asked whether a full acquisition had been explored. Yes, Victoria said. The founder declined. Did you push? Twice, she said. Then I moved on. The board member nodded. Good decision, he said. James heard about the board presentation from Robert, who texted him the day after it happened. Robert's text was 3 lines. VP presentation went well. You were mentioned by name. Board asked about full acquisition. Victoria said you declined. Good decision, one board member said. James read the text at his desk in the spare bedroom of his house in Park Hill. The desk where 4 years of evenings had produced the thing that was now being discussed in Ashworth Digital's boardroom. He set the phone down. His wife, Ades, came in with 2 cups of tea. She had been a secondary school mathematics teacher for 9 years and had the quality of people who are genuinely interested in other people's thinking. She asked questions that went somewhere and listened to the answers as if the answers mattered, which they did. She looked at his face. Good news, she said. Good news, he said. She sat across from him at the desk that also functioned as a kitchen overflow table and a homework surface for their 2 children and the place where the 4 most productive years of James's professional life had been lived. She put her tea down. She came around, Ades said. It was not a question. She came around, he confirmed. How does it feel? James thought about the product launch event, about the glass of water, about 40 people in a room and a judgment delivered before he had finished saying his name, about the 8 months between then and the call, and the 2 days between the call and the conference room, and the decision he had made in those 2 days about what to do with it. He thought about the 4 years before all of that, about the evenings at this desk, about the 11 clients who had found him through referral rather than through visibility, one by one, over 4 years, the slow accumulation of people who had had a real problem genuinely solved and had told someone else about it. He thought about the trade-off he had made in year 2, visibility versus quality, the story versus the thing. Good, he said, genuinely good. Ades looked at him with the specific attention she brought to things that mattered. Not triumphant, she said. No, he said, not triumphant. She was wrong about me, and then she needed what I had built. That is not a triumph. That is just how things worked out. What is it then? He thought about this. Confirmation, he said, that the trade-off was right, that the 4 years were the right 4 years, that building the thing rather than building the story about the thing was the correct choice. Ades picked up her tea. For what it is worth, she said. I always thought so. I know, James said. That helped. The Ashworth digital engagement opened a door that the previous 4 years of deliberate invisibility had kept closed. Not because Victoria told anyone. She was precise about what she shared and with whom, but because Robert Mensah told 2 people, and both of those people were in positions to connect James with companies that had the same problem Meridian had had, and those connections produced conversations, and the conversations produced 3 new enterprise clients in the year following the Meridian deployment. James hired 2 more engineers. The team was now 13. The platform served 14 clients. He was approached twice more about acquisition by 2 different companies. He declined both times, clearly and without drama. He was not building toward a sale. He was building toward a platform that solved a problem as well as the problem could be solved, and when that was done, he would think about what came next. He was not done yet. Oh, he hired a head of sales for the first time. A woman named Patricia who had spent 12 years at enterprise software companies and who understood the difference between selling a product and helping a customer understand that they had a problem and that the problem had a solution. He told her in the first week, "We do not lead with the pitch. We lead with the problem. If they have the problem, we can show them the solution. If they do not have the problem, we thank them for their time." Patricia had worked for people who told her the opposite for 12 years. She found this refreshing. She also found, once she began talking to companies, that the problem was remarkably common. The spare bedroom in Park Hill was no longer adequate. James rented a proper office, a floor of a building in Reno, the kind of space that had good light and enough room for a team that was beginning to be a real team. He stood in the empty space on the day they got the keys and thought about 4 years of evenings at a desk in a spare bedroom, about 11 clients who had found him through referral, about a product launch event in October where he had held a glass of water at the edge of the room. He thought about what his mother had told him when he was 22 and starting his first corporate job and anxious about whether he was good enough for the room he was in. Do the work well, James. The work is the argument. Everything else is just waiting for people to notice. He had done the work. He had waited. People had noticed. He stood in the empty office in the good light and thought, "Yes, this is right. This is where the next part begins." Then he called his team and told them they were moving in on Monday. This has been a HeartLine Stories original. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Write to us at heartlinestories4d@gmail.com. Every heart has a story worth telling. This is HeartLine Stories, where yours matters. She said it in front of 40 people. That was the part that stayed with him. Not the words. He had been dismissed before, in smaller rooms and without witnesses, and he had developed a kind of scar tissue around it. The specific equanimity of someone who has learned, through repetition, that being dismissed tells you something accurate and useful about the person doing the dismissing, and very little about yourself. But 40 people. The product launch event for Ashworth Digital's new enterprise platform had drawn 200 attendees. Clients, investors, media, and the extended ecosystem of people who attend these events because being in rooms where things are happening is itself a form of currency. James Okafor had come because a mutual contact had suggested it, and because he made a habit of understanding the ecosystem his company operated in, even the parts of it that were several leagues above his current visibility. He had been at the edge of the room, near the catering table, holding a glass of water he hadn't really needed, wearing a suit that fit well and that still somehow felt in this particular room like a costume. Victoria Ashworth had been at the center, which was not an arrangement but simply where she was, the way rooms arrange themselves around people who have a sufficient density of certainty. She was tall, 40 years old, with the kind of presence that does not announce itself but fills whatever space it occupies completely. She had looked at him. Really looked. The assessing gaze of someone who processes information about people quickly and allocates attention accordingly, and had placed him outside the boundary of relevance before he finished saying his name. He had stood at the edge of the room for another 20 minutes, watching how she worked the room, learning what he could, and then he had gone home. He had not thought about Victoria Ashworth for 8 months. She had not thought about him at all. And then her company acquired a logistics firm, and the acquisition turned out to be a disaster, and the only platform in the world that could fix it was the one being run from the spare bedroom of the man she had dismissed in front of 40 people. This is that story. James Okafor was 37 years old and had been building Nexus Supply for 4 years. He had not set out to build a company. He had set out to solve a problem, a specific, expensive, concrete problem that he had watched play out, in different forms and at different scales, at 3 different companies he had worked with in his corporate career. The problem was at the intersection of inventory management and logistics coordination. This sounds dry. The problem was not dry. The problem was the invisible drain that cost companies tens of millions of dollars a year in ways that never appeared on a single line of a profit and loss statement, because they were distributed across hundreds of smaller inefficiencies that each fell below the threshold of individual attention. The problem was this: what a company thought it had, what it actually had, and what was moving toward it were almost always 3 different answers to the same question, living in 3 different systems that communicated with each other imperfectly or not at all. Inventory systems and logistics systems had been built, over decades, by different teams with different priorities, and the seams between them were where money disappeared. Shipments that arrived to find the inventory full when the logistics system thought it had space. Orders that were committed to delivery timelines that the inventory data, had anyone looked carefully enough, showed could not be met. Products that sat in warehouses, because the system that knew they needed to move was not talking to the system that could move them. James had watched this problem drain resources and create chaos, and generate the specific frustration of problems that are structural and therefore invisible to the people suffering from them, who could see the symptoms but not the cause. He had spent 4 years building the solution, not dramatically, not with investor capital and press coverage and the startup ceremony that the tech industry used to signal that something mattered. With his own time, his own money, and the specific stubbornness of someone who has identified a real problem and cannot let go of it until the thing is built correctly. He had written the first version of the platform in the evenings after his corporate day job, then transitioned to full-time as the platform found its first clients, then built out the team, carefully, 1 person at a time, only when the revenue justified it. The team was now 11 people. The platform served 11 clients. All 11 had been acquired through referral. 1 client telling another about the thing that had fixed their supply chain, with the specific enthusiasm of people who have had a genuine problem genuinely solved. None of the 11 had left. The platform was architecturally elegant. James knew this not from pride, but from the regular feedback of engineers at client companies who integrated with it and who would occasionally send him messages that said things like, "Whoever built this knew what they were doing." It integrated with 14 categories of existing software infrastructure without requiring any of it to be replaced. It created real-time coordination between inventory and logistics through a coordination layer that sat on top of existing systems, which meant deployment was measured in weeks rather than years, which was the specific characteristic that made it different from everything else in the market. It had never been featured in a publication. It had never been presented at a conference. It had no presence in the circles where Victoria Ashworth moved, no visibility in the rooms where she made her decisions. It was, by the only definition James applied, the one that asked whether the thing worked and whether it solved the problem, completely real. And it was, by the definition the world used to measure such things, invisible. This was not an accident. James had made a deliberate decision in year 2 of building Nexus Supply about the relationship between visibility and quality. The decision was this: The tech industry rewarded visibility. It rewarded the appearance of momentum. The funding announcements and the press coverage and the conference speaking slots and the social media presence that signaled to the market that a company was real and growing and worth paying attention to. These signals had value. They opened doors. They attracted talent and capital and the specific attention of people who could accelerate a company's growth. They also cost something. They cost time. The time spent cultivating the signals rather than building the product. They cost focus, the subtle but real cognitive shift from making something excellent to making something that appeared excellent. They cost authenticity, the gradual drift from what the company actually was toward what the company needed to appear to be in order to maintain the narrative. James had watched companies navigate this trade-off in his corporate career and in the startup ecosystem he moved adjacent to, and he had observed that the companies that chose visibility tended to produce products that were optimized for the pitch rather than for the problem. They were impressive from a distance. They were less impressive when you tried to use them. He had decided in year 2 that he would build the thing. He would not build the story around the thing. The thing would be the story, eventually, if it was good enough. And if it was not good enough to eventually speak for itself, no amount of story building would fix that. This decision had consequences. One consequence was that the 11 clients Nexus Supply served were extraordinarily well served. They had James's complete attention and the complete attention of his team, undistracted by the machinery of visibility, and the result was a platform that worked the way things work when the people building them are focused entirely on making them work. Another consequence was that James Okafor spent a product launch event in October holding a glass of water at the edge of the room, while the CEO of a company that would, 8 months later, desperately need what he had built, dismissed him before he finished saying his name. He had accepted this consequence. He had made the trade-off deliberately. He had not, at the time, known about the acquisition. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from. Please like, subscribe, and share HeartLine Stories. Every subscriber brings more stories like this. Now, back to the story. Victoria Ashworth had built Ashworth Digital from a 3-person consulting firm into a 400-person enterprise software company over 12 years. She had done it through a combination of technical clarity, commercial aggression, and the specific talent, rarer than it appeared, of knowing which problems were worth solving and which were not. She was not a person who made obvious mistakes. She made mistakes, as all people who make decisions make mistakes, but they were the non-obvious kind, the kind that required hindsight to identify, and that looked in real time like reasonable choices given the information available. The acquisition of Meridian Logistics was not an obvious mistake. Meridian had a strong client base, 43 enterprise clients distributed across logistics, retail, and healthcare, representing a footprint that complemented Ashworth Digital's existing service network. The due diligence had been thorough. The integration plan had been detailed. The financial modeling had been conservative, in the specific way of financial models that are prepared by people who know what they are doing. What the due diligence had not fully captured, what no due diligence process, Victoria would later reflect, was fully equipped to capture, was the operational reality underneath the reported metrics. Meridian Logistics ran on 14 separate inventory management systems, acquired through 17 years of organic growth, small acquisitions, and the specific kind of technical debt that accumulates when a company is growing fast enough that the problems of the previous infrastructure are always someone else's problem next quarter. The 14 systems communicated imperfectly with each other and with the logistics scheduling infrastructure. The order fulfillment error rate, orders that went wrong in some way between receipt and delivery, was 11%. 11% sounds like a manageable problem. On 43 enterprise clients at Meridian's transaction volumes, it meant approximately 11,000 incorrect orders per month. It meant an order management team that spent 30% of its time on error resolution. It meant client relationships that were maintained through the specific management of expectations rather than through the delivery of what had been promised. Meridian's clients had accepted this because Meridian's pricing had reflected it, and because the alternative was switching to a competitor whose error rate was 9%, which did not feel like enough of an improvement to justify the disruption of transition. Under Ashworth Digital's brand, priced at Ashworth Digital's rates, held to Ashworth Digital's service standards, 11% was not manageable. It was a crisis. Victoria spent 3 weeks working through the problem with her operations leadership. 2 consulting firms were engaged. 3 enterprise software vendors presented proposals. Each proposal involved replacing some significant portion of the existing 14-system infrastructure. Projects measured in 18 to 24 months, and budgets that added substantially to the acquisition cost while providing no guarantee of the outcome. She had been told by the second consulting firm that what she actually needed, a coordination layer that could sit on top of the existing 14 systems and create real-time synchronization without requiring any of them to be replaced, did not exist as a commercial product. It could be built, but building it was a custom engineering project, not a purchase. Then find me someone who has built it, Victoria said. Robert Mensah, her head of operations, was the person who found Nexus Supply. Robert Mensah was 41, and he had been in operations management long enough to have developed the specific professional virtue of caring more about finding the right answer than about being the one who had found it. He spent a week searching. He was systematic about it. Not just the obvious channels, the industry databases and the vendor networks and the analyst reports, but the less obvious ones. The forums where operations engineers discuss their actual problems. The LinkedIn posts from supply chain professionals talking about systems they had encountered. The technical documentation repositories where real platform specifications lived, unfiltered by marketing. He found Nexus Supply on the 3rd day, mentioned in a comment thread on a supply chain engineering forum. The person who mentioned it was a logistics engineer at a mid-size retailer who had written, "The only platform I have found that actually solves the coordination problem without a rip and replace is this one," and included a link. Robert followed the link. He read the documentation. He read it again. It was, he thought, the most honest technical documentation he had encountered in his professional life. It described exactly what the platform did and exactly what it did not do. It described the integration architecture in specific technical terms, not the simplified version that marketing produces for executive audiences, but the real version for the engineers who would actually implement it. It included case studies with actual metrics, not the curated metrics of success stories, but the complete picture, including the implementation challenges and how they had been resolved. Robert read the case study for a company whose supply chain situation was substantially similar to Meridian's. Then he emailed the contact address on the website. The reply came in 40 minutes. Victoria joined the call the next morning without announcing herself as CEO. She did this sometimes, not as subterfuge, but because the presence of a CEO changes how a company presents itself, and she wanted to hear how Nexus Supply presented itself naturally. James started without slides. 10 minutes of conversation, asking questions, making sure he understood the specific shape of the problem before describing the solution. Victoria had been in thousands of sales conversations, and she had observed that the best vendors did this and most vendors did not. Most vendors were too anxious to present the product to spend enough time understanding the problem. When he was satisfied that he understood, he described the platform. He described it with the specific precision of someone who has built something and understands every component of it. Not the simplified version, the real version. He used technical language when technical language was accurate and plain language when it was not, without the condescension of someone who has decided their audience cannot handle precision. Robert asked good questions. James answered them completely, including the questions whose complete answers revealed limitations of the platform. Victoria noted this, the willingness to describe what the platform did not do. Most vendors manage this information carefully. James offered it directly. When Robert had run out of questions, Victoria unmuted herself. Mr. Okafor, Victoria Ashworth, one direct question. A pause, very brief, not the practiced pause of someone performing consideration, but the genuine pause of someone registering information. Of course, he said, a platform with this capability, solving a problem this expensive, documented this well. Why is it still an 11-person company? He was quiet for a moment. Because I built it to solve the problem rather than to be visible, he said. Visibility costs attention. Attention is what the platform needs. I made a trade-off. You have been making that trade-off for 4 years. Yes. Are you open to reconsidering it? That depends on what reconsidering it would look like, James said. And who was asking? Victoria looked at the screen. At this person who had been building, quietly and without witnesses, the thing her consulting firms had told her could not be bought. Can we meet in person? She said. He arrived at Ashworth Digital's offices on a Tuesday morning. The building was in lower downtown Denver. Glass and steel, the specific aesthetic of a company that has earned the right to spend money on its environment. He gave his name at the desk. He was directed to a conference room on the 14th floor. He stood at the window and looked at the city below, at the mountains in the distance, at the particular clarity of a Denver morning in late autumn. He heard the door open behind him. He turned. Victoria Ashworth stopped. The recognition moved across her face. He watched it happen. Not the polite, managed recognition of someone deciding how to respond to an awkward situation, but the genuine, unguarded recognition of someone whose brain has just made a connection they were not expecting to make. Her face did what faces do when they are being honest rather than managed. She looked at him. At the room. At the specific situation she was standing in. James looked at her with the expression of someone who has known something for 2 days and has decided, in those 2 days, exactly what to do with it. Miss Ashworth, he said, good to meet you properly. She sat down across from him. She was quiet for a moment. The quiet of someone taking stock. You knew, she said, when I said my name on the call. Yes. And you came anyway. You have a problem I can solve, James said. What happened 8 months ago is a separate matter from that. She looked at him. Is it?